Okay. All right, let's jump in. God bless you for actually coming into class today. It is unbelievably cold, but it's supposed to get nicer this afternoon by Canadian standards, I think. Okay, so I believe we ended here on. I think we ended here on Friday. I don't think we got through here yet. Definitely. Okay, I know we didn't do this. So I'm just trying to remember where we were. Okay, so we're going to keep going talking about kind of the Canadian labor force, what it looks like. I'm working diligently on marking. I sort of have 3 midterms I need to mark, so I'm kind of flitting between 3 of them. So I do 10 here, 10 there. This is probably not the most efficient way to go, but I feel like it's the most fair, so no one is having to wait, weeks until I get done. Okay, so hopefully I should be done. I really hope by the end of the week, but we will see. Okay, so talking about the labor force. Actually, let me just check questions. No questions. Perfect. Okay. One of the big things that's happening, obviously, in labor forces across the West, and Canada is no exception, is an increase in educational attainment, right? This is why you're all here, or presumably at home watching this at some point. I think I've described this previously, although I also teach this in sociology of youth, so I can't remember. But what we've seen, generally speaking, is the number of people who have only a high school diploma, right, which used to be all you needed. It used to be sort of the credential you needed to get a good job in Canada, right, to go down to the Ford factory in Windsor, the day after you graduated from high school and talk to the foreman and get a job. That was your high school diploma. So the percentage of those, with a high school diploma or less has fallen substantially from 68% of men and 66% of women in 1975 to now it's only 31% of men and 24% of women, right? And the percentage holding a university degree, right? So this is your 4-year degree, 4-year bachelor's. I'll just batch. Has risen considerably, right? And I'll show you this on a chart in a sec. It's about a 27% of men or 28% of men and over a third of women. Now, a lot more than that have post-secondary training if you consider other types of post-secondary education. So if you consider something like the trades, right, and if we're not snobby about the trades, we get to about 2/3 of Canadians having or 2-year trades and like 2-year diplomas. So not an undergraduate degree, but a 2-year certificate or diploma. If we include those, right, we have probably about 2/3 of Canadians holding some kind of post-secondary education. I mean, I had a fight with I was reviewing a textbook on youth, and the authors of the textbook had made the claim that only about 1/3 of Canadians, had a post-secondary education. And I got into a fight with them about this because I was reviewing the book, and this is what reviewers do. Because if you include these, right, we're talking about, about 2/3 of Canadians now having these. Okay. Now, what we're seeing though, and you probably don't see this as much in engineering as we do in humanities and social sciences, but we see increasing pressure from both businesses and from government to make education, quote unquote, relevant for the job market. And so what we've seen is kind of a hard shift, away from what you might call the liberal arts to more STEM fields, right, that are more STEM and vocational, I guess, programs that have direct outputs into the economy, whereas, social sciences and humanities tend to have softer inputs, and the skills that are created are more soft skills. Okay, now, this is one of these things that's really kind of a challenge. Universities and governments are really, really bad at figuring out what skills are going to be useful in the future. For example, a couple of years ago, everybody was like, oh, we should teach everybody how to code. And now we have professors, in our department who are teaching how to code in Python and R, who are saying, don't bother learning how to code because AI is going to do it all for you, right? So we're really bad at I don't know if that's true. I have my doubts. Who codes the code? I don't know. That's the question I always have with AI. But it's hard to predict what skills are going to be useful in the future. So a lot of government programs, that have focused on creating relevant skills have often ended up, creating skills for the economy of yesterday rather than the economy of tomorrow because they're just not particularly efficient at it. Okay. So here you go. This is our chart of, 1975 versus today, right? So 1975, high school or some completed for men was 44% of the population, right? Almost 45. 0 to 8, so basically 0 to 8 years of education was almost a quarter of the population. And we see our, some post-secondary was 9.8. And then our actual completion of post-secondary for men was really small, right? 11.8%, so that would have been trades or certificates of some kind, or a university degree, 10%. For women, right, fewer of them had 0 to 8 years, but more of them had, only a high school education. Some post-secondary was considerably higher than men, and they were below in undergrad degrees. Okay, by 2018, obviously this has changed, and almost nobody had, 2% versus 1.1% 2.2% for men, 1.1% for women have 0 to 8 years, right? Probably because sometime in the 60s they got really serious about making sure that truancy laws were enforced, and you had to go to school until you were 16 years old. High school has also gone down, right? Only about a quarter, let's say a little bit over a quarter for men, a little bit less than a quarter for women, now have a only high school or less. But the big change, and this one's gone down as well, so fewer people with some post-secondary, but lots more post-secondary degrees. Better than a third of all men and women have some kind of post-secondary degree. And for both, right, you've seen double-digit growth in university degrees. You can see how much it's grown for women, right? Just an absolutely massive jump for women in terms of university degrees. So what we have here, is a much more educated workforce. All through, we have fewer of them that have just high school or less, and many, many more that have a university degree of some kind. Like I said, almost 2/3, or university degree or some kind of post-secondary degree. Okay. I thought you'd like this graphic. I don't know why. Okay, so one of the problems, though, that we consistently see as our workforce is getting more educated is the problem of what's called underemployment, right? Where the types of jobs that people tend to do potentially don't require a postgraduate degree, right? So you wouldn't technically need it. You don't need it, but employers want it. And I'll give you an example. So when I graduated from my undergrad back in the pre-modern times of 2005, so I looked around for a job for a while, and finally, got my I guess I worked at Toys R Us for a little bit, and then I got more of a full-time job working at a company called Enterprise Rent-A-Car, which I will lovingly refer to as ERAC. And it was kind of a funny place. And I don't know if it's still this way now, but at the time, Enterprise Rent-A-Car had this policy that they only hired people with a post-secondary degree, right? So to work at Enterprise Rent-A-Car, you needed some kind of post-secondary degree. And to this day, I cannot figure out why. Because frankly, aside from what was the job, it was basically filling out forms. You had to go through the rental contract with someone, but this is a task, frankly, so simple that a child could do it, a reasonably intelligent child, and washing cars, right? You actually, and it was always fun because they also required you to wear a suit. So, a suit, jacket, shirt, and tie, and a white shirt, no less, except on Fridays where you could wear a blue shirt, and Saturdays when none of the management came in and I wore a pinstripe shirt just because I was rebellious and all that. But there was nothing in the job that, required more than a basic degree of intelligence. Like a high school graduate could easily do this job. You could read, write, and talk to people. You were good. And so this is what we would call underemployment, right? I was underemployed because I had this lovely qualification of an undergraduate degree, and yet I was working in a job that required, that was essentially unskilled, right? It's basically an unskilled job altogether. So this is kind of what's happening. More people are getting post-secondary degrees, but there aren't necessarily more job. Well, okay, so there's two things happening, right? So the first one is there's a skills mismatch. So you likely have, and definitely do, jobs in, say, STEM fields. And it could be anything, right? Like biotech, engineering, statistics, all sorts of things. You have lots of jobs in kind of STEM fields, but not enough graduates necessarily to do all of those jobs. So in those fields, you'll have a lot of job openings. But we're training a lot of people in, undergraduate degree. So I laugh because I'm a sociologist. We train a lot of sociology students. A lot of sociology, like our favorite double major is psychology and sociology together, which was voted by industry groups in the United States as potentially the most useless of all undergraduate degree combinations, which I tell this to my students who have a psych and soc minor major in some combination, and I watch them die a little bit inside. But we train a lot of people, let's say, in degrees that don't have a clear output, right? It's not clear to what job you're going to go, right? What job is that going to end in? What job do you do with an undergraduate degree in English? What job do you do with an undergraduate degree in psychology and sociology, right? It's not clear. And so in these rising numbers, Enterprise Rent-A-Car. It's Enterprise. I'll talk more about Enterprise Rent-A-Car later. It's a deep-seated trauma in my life. I will never get over it. I still have nightmares about working there. And I'm just kidding, but not really. Okay. So when we see, particularly in these two numbers, right? Though you do have some here as well. You have a lot of jobs without clear outputs, right? What job do you do? Because we have a lot, and we still have to say like about 2/3 of those degrees that women are getting are in social sciences or arts, or humanities, you'd say. And so the outputs aren't necessarily super clear. What do you do with that degree? Okay, so we have a skills mismatch, from the way that we train people. And, how shall we say this? I'll be honest with you. We have this really, I think in Canada, kind of stupid way of doing things. And let me, when it comes to choosing our undergraduate degrees, and I'll put it to you this way. This is the way a lot of people decide what they're going to do as an undergraduate degree, which is, follow your passion. What are you interested in? Which, for people going into STEM fields probably works out really well. For people going into social sciences and humanities tends to work out a lot less well. And just, I don't know, if you have children at some point, follow your passion is a really stupid approach to education. I say this as someone who followed my passion and spent a subsequent, 13 years in post-secondary education. Bless you. So, there's that. It's a really bad plan because there's not necessarily a job, that relates to your passion. So you're kind of putting yourself at the mercy of the market, saying, well, I hope my passion has a job that comes out of it, even if my passion is like theater design, right? Which is a great job, but there's probably like 10 jobs like that in Edmonton, right? So we do have this philosophy because we're super individualistic, that people should follow their passion and do what makes them happy. And it doesn't always work out. So we have a really bad thing, which means we end up with a skills mismatch. Too many people that have majored in theater design and not enough actual jobs. Okay, so of our roughly, people 15 to 24 who held a university degree, and most of those are going to be in the end of that, 22 to 24, they reported doing a job that did not require it. And obviously, younger Canadians are more likely to be underemployed, sorry, not unemployed. That's true as well. But we'll talk about that in a sec. Now, part of this is normal, right? Because chances are that if you're if you're coming out of an undergraduate degree, you have very little very little experience, which is where co-ops are useful, right? And why they get you to do a lot of them in engineering. You don't have a lot of experience, so you might have to start, somewhere. My sister, who is an engineer, a materials engineer, ended up starting working at Leadcore in their mod yard, basically doing some pretty basic, welding analysis, even though, her expertise was much more in just straight up materials. And now, she's happily employed doing a whole bunch of material engineering stuff that I don't understand really. But she spent about 7 years working, kind of starting jobs until she ended up getting her PEng and then working her way through a bunch of kind of, let's say, dead-endy engineering type jobs until she landed a really good engineering job. So for that whole period, she would have been pretty significantly underemployed, right? Staring at welds all the time was not really, what she trained to do, and is slightly not an engineering job in some ways. Okay, do you want fries with that? Okay, I can laugh at my own people, right? Okay, let's keep an eye on the time here. Oh, we're doing great. So LFP, we're going to talk LFP kind of throughout the course. Labor force participation. So labor force participation is a really important government metric. And if you ever look at government statistics of jobs, almost always you're going to be looking at some measure of labor force participation. So how do we measure LFP, and how is it measured so that it excludes certain categories? Okay, so really straightforward, the way that we measure how many people are participating in the labor force. The number of individuals 15 years of age or older who who are working and those looking for work, so the unemployed. Now, what ends up happening, and this is where sometimes, labor force statistics can get really confusing. And sometimes, how shall we say, there can be a significant hidden part of the workforce that disappears from labor force statistics. Okay, so in order for you to be counted as part of the labor force, you have to be out of work but actively looking for work in the past 4 weeks, right? So in the past month. If you stop being counted, or if you stop looking, you stop being counted as part of the labor force. So there's always a part, like a shadow part of the labor force of people who just stopped looking, right? And there's always going to be, significant portions in some place of people just not looking. This happened a lot during COVID, right? Where labor statistics during COVID were super unreliable because some people had lost their jobs and maybe they had, jumped on CERB or something like that. And they were actually just not looking for jobs because there were no jobs available. So in some cases, the labor force participation rate looked a lot better than it actually was, because we had, a couple of years where people were just like, yeah, I'm not gonna bother working, especially young people, right? During COVID, our 15 to 24 demographic, right, who work a lot of, low-end retail and hospitality jobs, a lot of them simply were not looking for work because there was no work available. So it kind of screwed up our labor force participation. Okay, the other thing that doesn't count, unpaid household and childcare is not considered part of the labor force. So, your stay-at-home parents don't get counted because they are not working and they are not looking for work. So, they are not counted as part of the labor force either if they, if these people still exist in great numbers. Okay. So, historically, right, if we look at Canada, about 53%, go back to 1900, right? So at that point, Canada, right, is the 7th largest economy in the world. We're number 7. No, that doesn't quite roll off the tongue. About 53% of Canadians 15 or older were in the labor force. And that stays roughly the same, all the way to the 1970s, right? It kind of stays around 57% from 1911 to 1970, and only increases once we hit the 1970s as more women enter the labor force, right? So what we have, in the 1970s, a big push for women to start getting into the labor force. Obviously, you have things like birth control becoming widely available. So birth rates go down significantly. You have things like what we'll call labor-saving devices. Like the dishwasher and washing machine that basically take a lot of the work that women did in the home to kind of keep their families clothed, keep things clean. Mostly that. I guess some of the cooking gets outsourced to like microwavable foods. The vacuum makes cleaning the house a lot easier as well. And that all comes in the kind of 50s and 60s. And by the 1970s, there's less for women to do in the home. And so what ends up happening is more of them, the birth rate goes down too, so they have less kids. So more of them end up in the labor force, right? Working for paid work. So yeah, the labor force participation rate in Canada is 60% by the mid-70s, 67% by 1989. And it kind of bounces around, about 65 to 67% from then on, right? So the rate for men kind of slowly declining over time while the rate for women is rising. Okay, do I have a... I'm so sorry. That sounds hard. go into sociology and psychology. You can follow your passion and be unemployed forever, or do 10 years of grad school. Your choice. I don't know what to tell you. Okay, so gender gap. There's still more men than women in the labor force, right? But it has considerably narrowed, right? If you look at, I think again, this is 2018, so these are a little old. 77 participation rate for men was 77% back in the 70s, 47 for women, for this kind of average rate. And it's narrowed considerably, right? This gap has gotten smaller over time. And the landmark year, and I guess the gap was about 8.3% in 2018. Landmark year was 1980, when the majority of Canadian women were in the labor force. So over 50% of women were in the labor force. And again, broadly driven by a couple of things. Changes in culture, principally. Women returning to work. 60s and 70s, it was women returning to work after their children principally were in school or had left home, depends on who you're talking about. In the 1980s and 90s, the growth was driven by women entering the workforce while raising kids, right? And we see the growth of things like, daycare and the childcare industry at this point. Prior to this, almost no one went to daycares, and there were almost none around. And today, it's a normal part of the landscape. Okay, for Indigenous Canadians, and I looked these numbers up. So as of December 2024, our national unemployment rate is 6.8% nationally. Alberta is about 7.4, so Alberta is a little bit higher. For Indigenous Canadians, it's about 11.6 in the same period. Now, this number, always hangs around considerably higher than the overall national unemployment rate. Indigenous Canadians are much more likely to experience unemployment. Now, much of this is driven by location. Indigenous people who live on reserve, and especially remote, like very remote reserves, tend to have far higher unemployment rates. So, Canada, we all know Canada. We love Canada, right? Most of the jobs are clustered in major cities, right? Your Montreal's, Halifax, Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg. Is Winnipeg a major city? It has a hockey team, so we'll count it. Saskatoon, Edmonton, Calgary, Vancouver, Victoria, right? These are sort of our major cities. And the bulk of employment, probably somewhere between 80 to 85% of the employment happens in and around those major centers. A large percentage of Indigenous people live in reserves in remote areas, more in the prairies than other parts of the country. And the further you are from those major cities, the higher your unemployment rate, because there just isn't much industry in a lot of places. So Indigenous people face, either they have to leave the reserve to work off reserve, or they face high unemployment. And it's, both of them have issues. Okay. They also have a higher incarceration rate, higher rates of substance abuse, and all sorts of things that make employment really difficult. And on average, considerably lower incomes than the Canadian average, right? And the Canadian average is somewhere around, I think, $54,000 a year. And I think for Indigenous people, it's somewhere between 38 and 42. So that's pretty low wages and pretty hard to make a living with those kinds of wages. Okay. Oh, I guess I can clear that comment. Again, we'll talk about enterprise later. Okay, people with disabilities and younger Canadians, I've lumped these together on one slide. Canadians with disabilities face significant challenges, right? They earn 20% less than those without, and about half of them are unemployed, right? Typically because of their disabilities. Now, for younger Canadians, there's a lot of volatility in their averages, right? They tend to go up and down pretty considerably. And I mean, this is pretty typical of youth employment in general. They are the most disposable. They're the first ones fired in economic downturns. Often the last ones hired, and so they face considerable challenges. Now that said, the gender gap in youth employment is relatively small. You actually don't see the gender gap really sort of moving until people start to have kids. And more women tend to exit the workforce, at least temporarily. Okay. Now, youth unemployment in general, okay, so I guess I'll say the group 20 to 24 have higher employment rates since they're out of school, so that helps. But generally speaking, the Canadian youth unemployment rate is about 2 times the overall unemployment rate, right? So the national average. And this is actually pretty consistent. You can kind of track it over time, and it's really, really quite consistent. Unemployment for young people is basically almost always 2 times the national average, which is much better, say, than in some places like Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Greece, where it's often triple or quadruple the national average. And I don't know where it is now. A couple of years ago in Spain, the youth unemployment rate was around 50%. So that is challenging. Today, right, as of December 2024, the youth unemployment rate in Canada was about 14.4%. So slightly more than because our national average is 6.8. So it's slightly higher than 2 times the national average. So young people tend to face much higher unemployment and more difficulty finding jobs. Okay. What am I doing for time? I know I'm just like rattling off statistics. So I promise won't be the rest of the course. So, over time, the labor force participation rate of older Canadians has gone down, particularly among men. The average age of retire, so more, I guess when we talk about older Canadians, for a long time, people were retiring earlier, right? Earlier retirement was playing a role, especially for our vaunted boomers, right? The boomers got to retire early. Like I said, my mom retired at 55, which sounds like a pretty sweet deal. I'm like, wait, that means I only have 13 years to work. I'm definitely not retiring at 55. That grad school took a few years off my earnings. I'm on the Freedom 85 plan, I think. No, hopefully not. Okay. I can't erase anymore. There we go. Okay, so the average retirement age in 1976 was about 65 years old. By 97, it had dropped to about 61. And since then, it's hovered kind of around 62, 63. And again, there's all sorts of pension implications for this and all sorts of potential problems. I think for Canadian men, life expectancy is about 78. For women, it's somewhere like 86. So there's a lot of years, between 62, 63 and 78, 86, where you're paying pensions to people. Okay, now, for most older Canadians, some of them have had issues here. Insecurity, loss of investment value, which leads at times to a rising retirement age. But in fact, if we look at especially the baby, this was true, I guess, for the silent generation. So anyway, you can look it up. For the boomers, for the most part, are the wealthiest generation in Canadian history. So they are doing pretty well. Okay, why do people retire? Well, about a third of them retire for health reasons, right? So they're no longer healthy enough to work. A third of them because they don't want to work anymore, and a third would keep working under modified conditions. And usually, so this was my father-in-law for years, actually. The conditions can be lots of different things. But let's say in the case of my father-in-law, he wanted fewer hours, right? So he wanted to work fewer hours. He's an engineer too, a petroleum engineer. Fewer hours is a really common one, and longer vacation. And the one we're seeing increasingly is remote, right? Telecommuting, working from home, or working from your condo in Phoenix or whatever it happens to be, right? So they would continue working under modified conditions, but when employers are unwilling to meet those conditions, instead of doing that, they retire. I guess that was kind of my dad too. My dad worked for the Alberta government, and he at one point was like, look, I'm going to take your buyout package of my entire year's salary unless you reduce my workload. And they were like, no. And so he retired. And then, as it turns out, because the government is stupid and bad at everything, that's a different story. They didn't have anyone who knew how to do his job, so they brought him back out a contractor at 4 times his salary for the next 10 years, which, might have just worked to reduce his workload and save, 3 times. But he did very well. Okay. Yes, work for the government, retire, then become a contractor at 4 times your salary. This is a great hustle. I hope to win that one day. Okay, older men who lose their jobs tend to have more difficulty finding work. They have much higher wage expectations than younger workers. And often, they retire taking packages. And what ends up happening in lots of places, right, is, when the economy downturns or governments get into financial trouble, they offer older workers retirement packages, 2 years salary or something, just to get rid of them. Okay. And older women generally retire earlier than men for lots of reasons. Part of this increasingly is they're better educated, so they made more money, right? Okay. What time is it? Of all the things the university could really use, a clock in these rooms so I can see what time it is would be super useful. All right, we got 10 minutes. Okay, and how many slides left on here? Oh, we'll see what we can do in 10 minutes. Okay, I will go forward and see if... Ooh, that's still pretty bad. According to world statistics, 25%, greater than 25% unemployment in Spain as December 2024. 23 for men, 26 for women. That is still really bad. Okay. If trends in unemployment keep increasing, wouldn't a majority of workers eventually force either work jobs that require very high qualifications or labor-intensive jobs? So this is kind of an interesting one because I can speak to this question. What seems to be happening is, I don't want to, here, I'll write it on this slide. This is a really common phrase now, sadly. It's a master's is the new bachelor's. So what is happening with a lot of these folks is they are actually either staying underemployed, and that does happen, right? People will stay in underemployment for a long time, but an increasing number of university graduates are now seeking to do postgraduate degrees. And I know this because, and I can only say this anecdotally, I'm not keeping statistics, but in the last probably 3 years, the number of students I have asking me to write letters of recommendation for graduate school has gone up just absolute, like an astonishing amount. I probably get 100 requests for letters of recommendation a year from students. And sadly, most of them I actually don't know, so I won't write them letters, but it has gone up, like, honestly, September and November, my inbox is flooded completely with requests for letters of reference. So more people are moving into, postgraduate degrees because, the really good jobs are now things that require a postgraduate degree. I guess what happened with the bachelor's degree is it went from being, in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, the thing that got you the really great jobs to now it's replaced the high school diploma as a kind of base credential just to get into the kind of middle class range of the economy, right? So now, like I said, Enterprise Rent-A-Car, why are they looking for people with a bachelor's degree? I still have no idea. But even to get that kind of, modest service industry job, you needed this kind of degree. And I mean, okay, they had what I would describe as a pyramid scheme. It's like, you will start as a management trainee. And I remember the pitch at the training. It was like, you'll start as a management trainee. Why did they start you as a management trainee? Because you can pay management a salary. You don't have to pay them an hourly wage. And when you're working 60 to 70 hours a week, no one wants to pay you an hourly wage. But then it's like, oh, you can move up and become a assistant manager, branch manager, area manager, group rental manager, and on, right? So they were always pitching, it's like, you can move up the pyramid at Enterprise Rent-A-Car. They forgot that, the pyramid gets narrower as you get higher up on the pyramid. So, the people that start out here, they can't all go to here, or it becomes a rectangle, not a pyramid. And obviously, no organization can be a rectangle, because salaries tend to go up as you move up the pyramid as well. So that's kind of what's happening. More people now needing the bachelor's degree being just this kind of base credential means that more people need higher ed, even higher ed, outside of, say, vocational degrees. So, engineering, vocational, that's an L. Vocational, things like engineering, nursing, medicine, your MDs, dentist. By the way, dentists hate it when you call their degree vocational, but it absolutely is, because you know what you're going to do with a dentistry degree. I have really good friends who are dentists, and they drive really nice cars, but they also hate it when I call them a vocational degree. I'm like, well, I mean, you train for a specific job, right? And they're like, yes. I'm like, well, that's a vocational degree. Like, no, it's like a doctor. I'm like, I know it's hard to get into dental school, but it's still a vocational degree. You're basically just like a teacher. Say that to your dentist. They hate that so much, being compared to a teacher, because they think dentist is prestigious. I don't know how prestigious it is to clean crap off my teeth, but there you go. Okay, I'm being mean to dentists. Like I said, a couple of my really close friends are dentists, so I like to laugh. Why do companies offer retirement plans instead of just terminating employment? It seems like the latter would be cheaper option for businesses. I mean, I think it's about attracting people, right? If you're offering a pension plan and someone else isn't, the better employees are probably going to come work for you with the idea that they're going to get a pension. It doesn't always work out. Okay, how am I doing for time? 5 minutes. I wasted a bunch of time talking about dentists. I'm sorry. Usually 15 to 24 is kind of what we would classify as young Canadians in the workforce. Ooh, hang on. Get rid of that guy. Okay, I think I answered both of these. Fun times. Thanks for the questions. Those are fun. All right. Did I do this slide? No. Okay. Yeah, so we've seen big changes in the sizes of industries. So the service industry has grown and grown and grown, right? So again, service industry can be lots of things. But we tend to think of it as a tertiary industry, right? Kind of a third tier. Your primary industries are going to be things like resource extraction. So mining, oil, lumber, right? These are resource extraction. Secondary is going to be manufacturing and construction, turning a lot of those those primary goods into value-added goods. And your third tier is going to be service industry. Now, in Canada, right, this is growing. 78% of Canadians held service sector jobs in 2012, and this has only continued to rise. It's only something like 1%. Oh, I guess the other one in primary is agriculture, right? So farming. Only about 1% of people work in agriculture today in Canada, which is crazy given the amount of food we make. And all, manufacturing and construction have also declined pretty significantly, while the service industry has increased and increased. And we'll talk about this as we go through the course, because we do have to split when we say service industry, not all of these are good jobs. There are really good jobs in the service industry. We call these upper tier, distributive business, education, health, and welfare, and public administration. And then low tier, retail, hospitality, and other consumer services, right? And I'll put in there childcare, because, childcare is really poorly paid in Canada. Childcare. Okay. So, do I have any time left? 3 minutes. I can do this. I can do one more slide. Okay. Women are more likely than men to be employed in lower tier service industry jobs, right? So we look at lower tier, right? Retail, a little bit more. Accommodations and food services, a significant chunk more, and other services, quite a bit more. Now that gap is shrinking over time, right? As more men end up in kind of lower tier service industry jobs as well. In upper tier service jobs, women are concentrated in health, education, and social services, so less in finance, business, and STEM. More men are in things like trades, transport, professional, scientific, and technical industries. And I mean, if you look at some of these industries, right, transport, so trucking, I don't know if it's even here. I don't see it, but if we look at like trucking is like 90% male. So it's super concentrated. Piloting aircraft as well is another one that's super male dominated. And younger workers, more likely to work part-time, and therefore they're going to tend to be concentrated in these things: retail, food services, and other hospitality industries. Okay. How much should you focus on memorizing statistics? I will not ask you specifically to recite these statistics, but be aware of the trends. I think hopefully that makes sense. Okay. I can't do this. I don't have enough time. I have like 3 slides left. Okay, let's leave it there. Well, I'll finish my last 3 slides next time, and I'll add them on to the next unit, which is, I think, good jobs, bad jobs, no jobs, or job quality, I think I call it. We'll talk about what makes a good job in Canada. And we'll see if we can get away from statistics, just reciting statistics a little bit. Okay. Have a good day. We'll see you on Wednesday. Stay warm.